Well, I guess we can get started.
Okay, good.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Gina Ganscott, the Education Director here at the Penobscot Marine Museum. Tonight's presentation is part of our series of speakers sharing stories about sailing in Maine waters and beyond. I want to give a big thank you to our members and those of you who chose to donate to support our programming at Penobscot Marine Museum. More information about upcoming programs, membership, and donating can be found on our website and our Facebook page. This program has been made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Exploring the Human Endeavor. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Richard Ames, tonight's speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will share my screen and then we can get going.
Looks good.
Okay, just let me move this out of the way. There we go. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. I hope I won't bore you. This isn't going to be a very long talk, probably around 30-35 minutes. And then if you have any questions, we'd be delighted to take those at the end. And just as an outline of what this talk is going to be about, let's see. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what got me interested in researching ships, because that's what I spent a lot of time doing to create this book that you see an image of on the left. I'm going to talk a little bit about ship portraits, and of course, if you've been to the Penobscot Marine Museum, you've seen a lot of those. We'll talk some about how the research that I conducted was done and what some of the sources were. What's a full-rigged ship? You probably all know that. I'm going to talk about the full-rigged ships that were built at Castine, because that's the subject of the book. It was talk about Castine. The conditions that stimulated shipbuilding. Who in Castine was involved, and that's kind of an interesting story. The trade routes and the cargoes of the ships that were built in Castine, and the risks, which there were many. What caused this all to kind of fold up and go away? And then just talk at the end very briefly about some of the first-hand detailed accounts that are in the book that I won't have time to talk about today. So that's the outline. So first, so what got me interested in all of this? Growing up, I spent every summer in Castine at what's called the Whitney House, and you can see it there on the left. It's a house just to the left of the Castine Historical Society, if you've ever been there, on the top of the common. And it was completed in 1810 by Henry Whitney, who had been gone from a cabin boy all the way up to a ship's captain and spent his whole life basically at sea, and his wife, Lucy Perkins. They had 11 children, and most of them were involved in either the sea or things to do with shipping. The house then passed down to their daughter, Frances Whitney, whose first husband was also a ship's captain. He died rather young, and she ended up marrying his brother, Samuel. And in her early years, when her children were young, she spent a lot of time at sea also with her young children. It then passed down to their daughter, Mary Whiting, who really wasn't involved by the sea at this time. And then finally to my grandparents, Harriet Hatch and Oaks Ames. So since this house had stayed in the family for pretty much 170 years, it was just like stepping back into a museum. It was filled with all kinds of things related to shipping. It had ship portraits from the ships that the family members had owned, half models of ships, ship's clocks that have that chime that I was never able to figure out. There were a lot of family portraits from people through the generations, lots of furniture that had been brought back from many of the voyages overseas, lots of boxes of letters and documents from different generations that were all wrapped up in tiny little ribbons and bows. And in addition, family history, oral history, was a practiced tradition in the family. Both my grandparents, and particularly my great uncle, Francis Hatch, used to come by the house when I was staying there, and we'd walk around together, and he'd stop in front of various ship paintings or various portraits or pieces of furniture and tell stories that kind of talked about the people and what had happened and what those ships had done. And luckily, many of the items were labeled with descriptive information, because often, as we all know, if that's not labeled, you kind of lose track of it over the generations. My favorite item in the house was a portrait that hung over the fireplace in the main parlor. And as a young boy, I used to sit on the old sofa opposite that and just look at it, and then kind of walk up close to it and get a better look at it, because to me, it was very fascinating. So what is a ship's portrait? Its official definition is a specialized genre of former genre painting featuring an accurate description of a vessel. And the successful ship artists over time had a deep understanding of ships, and many of them had either been on ships or were shipwrights part-time, but they had a detailed understanding that enabled them to create very accurate depictions of ships. They were usually commissioned by either the ship owner, one of the ship owners, because there were many usually, or the captain of the ship, who himself was often an owner. And the various ship artists tended to have go-to settings for their paintings, and they tended to paint whatever ship it was in a very similar setting. This is a quote that I got from A.S. Davidson, Sam Davidson, who was a very well-known, unfortunately he died not long ago, very well-known expert on ship paintings, and consulted a number of museums and so forth. Now, I'm just going to read this quote. You can read it along with me. To the initiated, the skillful marine painting conveys its story with an eloquence unmatched by pages of the most eloquent prose. Recognizing the sort of vessel or even its individual identity or purpose, as well as discovering the coastal background, can be very satisfying. And of course, that was satisfying for him, and it was satisfying for me as well. Maybe we're just kind of strange ship people. So here's a detailed view of the painting that I was just talking about. As you can see, it has all the details of the rigging, the sails, the ropes used to reef the sails. It has lighthouses in the background. It has other ships kind of sailing in the background. And you can see little men kind of on board. And as we zoom into that, and I think you've been doing this at some of the talks at the museum there, you can see the crew towards the bow, working the lines and the sails. The name of the ship painted, the Weston Merritt, on the side there. Here's a detailed view of some of the ship's cabins, where some of the paying people who went on the ship would stay, much nicer accommodations than down below. Here's looks to be a mate kind of commanding some sailors to work the sails. There's the captain on the deck with his telescope, probably looking for a pilot to come and help them into the harbor, and you can see the helmsman there. And if you look in the background, the lighthouse on the left was the Skerries Lighthouse in Anglesey, which is an approach to Liverpool. So this ship was sailing into Liverpool. And off the stern, you can see the South Stack, which is also at Anglesey, which confirms that that's where it was headed. So what about researching vessels? I started my research in 1980 when my grandmother left the painting to me because she knew how much I loved it. What were some of the sources that I used? Of course, Lloyd's Register of Shipping, which has an annual register pretty much from the late 1700s until, probably up into the 1900s, and even today, is a great source. It has information where you can look up and find the name of the ship you're looking for, who was the master or the captain, what its tonnage was, where it was built, the owners, and so forth. So this is a source that I use for my research. There's also a number of records of ship ownership, and these are sometimes found online, but often at different maritime museums around the country that have collected these documents. There's also old archives of newspapers that are all available online now for a small fee. And these have information, and you can search by name, and these have information on ships as well. For instance, the one shown here is about the ship Ames from Castine that was collecting freight for a voyage. As I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of family archives, letters and so forth, and I was able to kind of pour through a number of these letters and was able to find references to the ships that the family owned, voyages, the letters were written back from and so forth, and so that was also very useful. Over the years, I've built up a library of reference books, and here's a small portion of them, and those were also very helpful. And one of the most helpful things were internet searches. And I found, I say Google searches here, and that's because I found that they were actually turned up more information than other search engines. And one of the most important sources I found was if you go into Google search, you can click on a down arrow and look for books. And Google has gone around the country and has scanned a very large number of out-of-copyright books, and I was able to find a lot of information about these ships in various books. And finally, maritime museum collections like the Penobscot Marine Museum. So what did I find? What did I find when I was researching this ship? So it was called the Weston Merritt that we saw earlier. It was built at Waldoboro in 1860. There were 15 owners with shares anywhere from 1/32 to 11/32. We'll talk about that a bit later on. 1/32 was owned by Henry Whitney Jr., who was the son of Henry Whitney, who owned the house and built the house. And he was actually a ship chandler in Liverpool. He had a small company there with 2 locations on the Liverpool docks called Weston Whitney. Weston was his partner. And I found in one of the letters a reference to the ship itself. I have bought a part of a new ship now building at Waldoboro. Will be off the stocks in August. I find as long as I remain in business, I'm bothered by partners to take part of a ship with them. So he was kind of a reluctant ship owner. He was kind of forced into this by people who would come into his shop looking for investments. In fact, he was actually, he went to sea as a cabin boy, as a young, probably about 13, 14 years old, but he didn't really like the sea so much, and that's how he ended up in Liverpool running a ship chandler business. So in 1864, during the Civil War, the Weston Merritt was sold to English owners and was renamed the Darwar. In 1868, it was sold to Dutch owners and renamed Erasmus, and then in 1873 sold to Norwegian owners and renamed the President. So it had quite an international life. And then it met its fate on a voyage from Chicoutimi, Quebec to Garston, England with a cargo of timber. And it actually was stranded on Miquelon Island in 1888, and that's where the little red A is to the right of the map down there. It was a total wreck. So it had a good life of 18 years. I also was able to discover by searching the internet a diary of a young man called A.R. Reed, who sailed on the maiden voyage of the Weston Merritt when it left Waldoboro on its maiden voyage to New Orleans. And there's a few quotes in there that I just put up here that I thought would be interesting. Left the wharf at 9 o'clock. In running out, we struck a small fishing schooner called the Lass, broke off her bowsprit, stays, etc. Also, both her cables and her rigging. Getting fouled, dragged her nearly half a mile where we got free from her by cutting some of the rigging. There was no one on board. So they got caught up in on this schooner and just cut it loose to drift. Hopefully someone was able to row out and retrieve it. He was a young boy. He'd never been at sea much, and he was rather sickly. So his father, who was one of the owners of the ship also, thought he'd toughen him up by sending him out to sea. I was much sick, more than ever before, and nothing would stop it. I did not quite reach the condition of wishing to be thrown overboard, though I felt bad when one Sunday a fine turkey was cooked and I was unable to eat any of it, while those who were free of the sickness ate, enjoyed, and laughed at us who were sick and unable to eat. And when they arrived in New Orleans, this is just when the elections were going on. There's much excitement here with regard to political questions of the day. Kind of sounds like today. There's much talk about the state of our country, and some little anxiety appears to be felt regarding the result. Lincoln's effigy is hung almost every day, and when it runs up, it is saluted with cannon and loud cheering. So here they are in the southern port, of course, very relying on cotton, and they weren't very excited about having Lincoln as a new president. So initial research that I did was published in the Castine Visitor, and I did a number of articles about sailing there and about the family and so forth. And after that, I decided to research the 19th century Castine-built sailing vessels. So I spent about 5 years doing that, hunting for information and pulling it all together in what resulted in the book. I discovered that there were 122 wooden-built vessels built at Castine of various rigs, and you can see there in the image, there are 4 sloops, 70 schooners, 23 brigs, 6 barks, 1 barkentine, and 18 ships. And because I couldn't research all of them, I decided to focus on the 18 ships, which were the largest of the vessels built in Castine. So what is a full-rigged ship? You probably know this already. It's a sailing vessel with 3 or more masts, all with square-rigged sails. The most famous of the full-rigged ships were the clippers. They get all the glory. They had an emphasis of speed over cargo capacity, built mostly in Boston and New York, or there were a few built in other places as well, like in Maine. They were built for speed to take the tea from China and prospectors to California and Australia for the gold rushes. And so speed was much more important than cargo capacity for these ships. They were narrow for their length, so they could cut through the water. They had tall masts and maximum total sail area, and they had very high operating costs. In contrast, the Maine shipbuilders mostly made these sturdier and rounder, what are known as downeasters. The people in New York and Boston who built clippers looked down on them and called them tugs and slowpokes. But they're actually the highest development of the sailing ship. They had fewer sails. You can see that the ship at the bottom has 1 less sail on its mast than the one at the top. They're optimized for speed, cargo capacity, and low operating costs, so a combination of all those. They had consistently fared passages. They were much more reliable than clippers, and they delivered their cargo in better condition. So of the 18 full-rigged ships built in Castine, I was able to find images of the ones that you can see there, which was quite fortunate. I guess many of them over the years have either disappeared or in private collections and wasn't able to find them. So what were some of the conditions that stimulated shipbuilding in Maine? Why were so many ships built in Maine? Well, geography and resources had a lot to do with it. You can see the map there. As you all know, Maine has a very craggy shoreline with lots of bays and inlets, which was perfect for building and launching vessels. There were large forests surrounding all these areas, and there was a large workforce skilled in wooden shipbuilding trades. There were a lot of vessels in demand for fishing because of, again, the long indented coast had a vigorous fishing industry. It was close to the Grand and Georges Bank cod fisheries, which also made it a convenient place to sail from for fishing. And salted cod was in high demand for urban immigrants and plantation slaves. So there was a huge demand for fish, which caused a lot more ships to be built. And at the peak, Maine provided about 1/5 of the fish produced in America. So 20% of the fish in America at its peak was provided from Maine. There was also a demand for vessels for trade. Maine had things they needed to export. As we talked about the fish, there was also lumber, lime, granite, ice, and other Maine products that needed an outlet. And there was a growing transatlantic trade with the West Indies and Europe. More wooden sailing vessels were built in Maine than any other state. So it was hugely known for its shipbuilding, and Maine vessels were considered very sturdy and strong and reliable. So if we look at the town of Castine and we think about who is involved in all this in one way or the other, we have a map here of Castine from 1860 with the names of the various houses and wharfs and things shown on it. And if we put blue dots on people who are involved, well, actually the shipbuilders, we can see those there. We then add kind of these fuchsia dots for people who are involved in ship making, rope makers, sail makers, shipsmith carpenters, and so forth. Then the merchants and fishing outfitters, and a number of them did both. They were both fishing outfitters and merchants. Those are shown in the red dots. Then we add the green for those who are just merchants. And then the captains, mariners, and seamen in the yellow dots. And finally, people who invested in ships. We found that from looking at the various records and so forth. And you can see that a large portion of the structures in town and the people who live there were related to either shipbuilding or shipping or merchants or one way or another. But most importantly, and it doesn't show up here so much, we need to talk about the women, because without the women, none of this could have happened. Because people involved in shipping, particularly on the trading vessels, not so much the fishing vessels, were gone for almost 11 months out of a year. And it's the women who held everything together and built networks to support and navigate these difficult times while their husbands were away. So what were the general findings that I had? So the size of ships built and grew over time. For instance, in the early 1800s, they tended to be smaller, about 200 tons capacity. And by the early 1850s, they're about 5 times as big, over 1,000 tons. And these were 2 ships built in Castine, one in the earlier 1800s and one in the 1850s that show that. Shipbuilding was expensive. The ship Antioch, built in Castine, cost $700,000 to build today's dollars. That was about 400 tons. And the 875-ton ship, William Witherley, cost about $1.5 million in today's dollars. So it was very expensive to build ships. Owning the ships was profitable but risky. And because of that, people tended to invest in shares of ships and spread their risk over owning multiple ones. For instance, you could buy up as small as a 1/32nd share, or up to a half or even 3/4 of a ship. And the owners invested in shares in multiple ships to spread their risk. If you look at the trade routes and cargoes of ships from Castine, we find the following. Castine was a bit unique in that it had a largely self-contained triangle of trade, and this was conducted by ships built in Castine and owned in Castine. The first leg of the journey started in Castine and took fish and lumber and produce and took it down to one of the southern ports of New Orleans, Savannah, or Charleston. They then picked up cotton, which was in high demand in the manufacturing areas of Europe, and primarily took that to Liverpool, but they also took it to other European ports. And then they returned with a load of salt, which was very important for the Maine fishing industry, to salt their fish. And they would return back and then unload that salt and start the whole thing again. There was an evolution of this trading pattern over the years, because the leg from the southern cotton ports to Europe actually was the most profitable leg. And so often these ships would do 2 journeys, taking cotton to Europe and back in a season, and then return at the end of the year, usually late in November, early December, with salt. The captains would often stay a couple of weeks at home, and then they'd start off again in early January and do it all again, year after year. When the Civil War came along, it caused a major disruption in this whole trading triangle, because cotton was no longer available for export. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. When I looked at the ports that the Castine-built ships visited, I found the following. In the earlier years, they tended to trade between the east coast of the United States and ports in Europe, and you can see all the red dots there. Later on, after the Civil War, and even during the Civil War in later years, they tended to carry different cargoes, not so much cotton, and tended to go further to the east and far east. So what were some of the risks that everybody involved in shipping faced? First one was weather, and you can see an image here of a ship sailing in some heavy weather. You can see some of the crew members standing up and trying to reef the sails. And in my research, I found many instances of people falling out of the rigging into the water, and of course that was absolute death, because there was no time to turn the ship around, and in foul weather you probably couldn't find the individual anyway. So the risk of weather was not just people falling into the ocean, but it was also being destroyed by a hurricane. The ships then, of course, didn't have GPS or anything to do with being able to detect weather, except maybe a barometer. And storms would come up suddenly, and many ships ran afoul of weather being wrecked as well. Pirates, everybody likes to hear about pirates. This was an image that was in the house at the top of the common and used to terrify me as a young boy. It shows these pirates trying to attract a trading vessel you see there on the right by pretending to be another trading vessel and trying to lure it close so they could attack it. There were a lot of ships that ran afoul of pirates, mostly during the earlier 1800s, and mostly in the West Indies. After about the mid-1840s, there was a big effort to kind of get rid of the pirates, and it wasn't such a large risk. But pirates was a risk in the early days, and many of the main ships ran afoul of them, and even some from Castine were chased by pirates. Of course, running aground was a big risk. There were charts available that showed entrances to harbors and so forth, but foul weather could push you off course. You could run up against an uncharted shoal. So many of the ships actually ended up running aground and being broken up. Fire was a huge risk. If you can think, these vessels were made entirely of wood, and of course cooking was done on board the ship with fires, and many ships caught fire and were totally burned. This shows it's a famous image of actually a transatlantic package ship that caught on fire, with everybody trying to scramble as far as they can away from it to be rescued. Disease was another risk, and here you see kind of a skeleton sailor with his yellow jack flag. Yellow fever was a large risk, particularly in the warmer and southern ports. There were smallpox, there was cholera, and of course, once a disease got onto a ship in close quarters, it traveled very quickly, and many people at sea died from disease. War was another risk. This shows an image of a Confederate raider burning a merchant ship, and during war, there were either privateers, or in this case, these raiders during the Civil War, and they could capture flags of ships of different flags and actually take them for prize. Securing cargoes was always a risk. You sailed into a port. There was nothing like advance information to know what the conditions at that port would be. So oftentimes ships would arrive at a port, and there wouldn't be cargo, or the prices for the cargo would be very low. So a good ship's captain was always searching for cargoes. And this is an advertisement of a ship, and there's many of these in history showing that they would put these up, and they say, okay, we have such and such a ship, and it's going to be sailing, and we're accepting cargo. Obtaining and keeping crews was also a very large risk. You can imagine that the sailors were kind of a rough lot. They often had issues with people on the ship in command, the captain and the mates and so forth. There was a lot of fighting, gambling, and so forth. So crews would often jump port if they didn't like their captain or the crew, or they felt that, or if they felt that they could get a better deal somewhere else. So captains were always struggling to find crew members and also reliable crew members. So what happened to all this shipbuilding and trade in Castine? What brought it to an end? So during the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate actions disrupted shipping. The Union Navy blockaded the southern cotton ports because exporting cotton was a huge generator of revenue for the southern states. And the Confederates also embargoed exports of cotton, hoping to drive the price up and to force Europe to intervene in the war. So there was almost like a double blockade of cotton. And so all of a sudden, the whole profitable leg of the journey disappeared. And as shown in that image earlier, and here it is again, the Confederates deployed privateers first, and then they had steam sail commerce raiders built secretly in England. And those captured and burned more than 200 American merchant vessels, which wasn't itself a large number, but it had a bigger impact because of the economic impacts. That caused the American vessels to be less competitive because capturing those ships drew up both the freight and war premiums and increased the insurance rates. And this resulted in neutral or non-US flagged vessels having a 25% cost advantage over foreign vessels. So what happened was more than 1,000 American vessels, which is about half the trading fleet, was sold abroad. And of those three ships there, the Adams, the Witherly, and the Samuel Adams, were Castine ships that were sold abroad during this time. But many of the Maine vessels were sold abroad, and particularly Maine vessels because they were looked on by foreign buyers as being some of the better ships built. One would have thought that maybe after the war, all those ships that were sold abroad could have been bought back again by the merchants. But unfortunately, that wasn't true because there were laws on the books in the United States that said once a ship had been sold abroad, it couldn't be repurchased and put under the American flag again. So all those ships kind of disappeared forever from the American fleet. There were also a significant number of changes in technology. At about this time, too, in the mid to late 1860s and beyond, there was an introduction of steel-hulled and steam-powered vessels, which many people thought were more reliable. There was also the expansion of the railroads, and all of a sudden the railroads became the kind of sexy thing to invest in, whereas shipbuilding and ship ownership had been kind of a way to make good returns, but everybody started shifting investments into the railroads. There was also a decline of the Maine shipping industry. The fishing bounty was repealed in 1866, and there were new fishing methods that changed after the Civil War, which required more capital. So previously, you had small villages like Castine, who a couple of fishermen would get together. They could buy a schooner or have a schooner built or build it themselves, and they could go out and they could fish and make pretty good money. They had the bounty to help subsidize that, but when the bounty went away and fishing technology changed, required larger vessels, larger crews, and so forth, it kind of shut some of those people out. So Maine's share of the cod and mackerel fisheries dropped significantly from 45% in 1860 to 20% in 1870. Some of the Castine ships continued to trade after this, as I mentioned, and there's three of them, the J.P. Whitney, the Castine, and the Picayune, but they tended to carry different cargoes to different ports than the typical trading ports of Europe. And after the Civil War, you can see there wasn't much shipbuilding in Castine done. There were only 12 schooners and 1 bark built after the Civil War, so it really did bring that period to an end. So, Castine's full-rig ships. They were the largest vessels built at Castine. They're owned and operated by local merchants and investors. Large proportion of Castine's inhabitants were involved in shipping. We saw that on the map. was a profitable but risky business. The Castine Triangle trade thrived until the Civil War, and a combination of economic and technological changes brought this all to an end. Now, I was able to find first-hand accounts for almost all of these ships, and those are included in the book. And here's just kind of a part of the index, which shows the names of the ships that I researched. And it has kind of an interesting story that talks about the times related to each ship. And this book, Risky Business, A Maine Village Goes Global, is available for purchase at the Castine Historical website. All the proceeds go to the Historical Society. And I hope if you enjoyed this talk, you'll purchase the book, because I think you'll find it quite interesting. And that's kind of the end of my talk, and I'd be happy to take any questions.